So I'm hoping this is going to be a good seminar, and you'll get the link for the notes later on, of course. I'm going to be working from notes, um, so keep me on subject. You can't see the notes. You will see the script that I've created for this. You won't see the notes I'm working from, but you will get them later on. And the reason I haven't put them up is because I know that you'll start reading the notes, and if it's different from what I'm talking about, it causes all sorts of confusion. Good evening, Atty. Nice to see you on here as well. And people from, my goodness, all over the place, South Africa and USA and everywhere. Great stuff. Okay, if you're new to my style of training, I'm Giuseppe. Buonasera. Come sta? I suspect Susie's with you as well. Hi, Susie, if you're there. If you're new to my style of training, ask questions when you want to, because I tend to talk in a continual stream, and I will occasionally ask if anybody's got any questions, but ask questions anyway. And if you've not been on one of my courses before, you might find yourself getting very irritated because I stopped to answer questions. If that happens, listen to the answers. Don't worry about the interruption to it, because whatever I talk about will be associated with the subject at hand. So I always do that bit of apology because I'm a non-standard teacher. I'm not all proper and make everybody wait until I say they can ask questions. Anger is one of the most fundamental of human psychological responses, and it's got its roots in our most ancient ancestors, the first sentient creatures to walk the face of the earth, around about 650 million years ago, long before any bipedals or other mammalian creatures. They would have been reptilian creatures. And the response itself is an automatic response, and it comes from the amygdala, and it's part of the earliest brain. And it's triggered by a recognition of danger. So anger is really a fear response, and it's really, we call it anger, we've given it the name anger, but really it's a much more complex response than the name suggests, a simple response of anger. It's an expression of fear, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more later. And if you've done BWRT, you'll know some of what I'm talking about. If you haven't done BWRT, don't worry, you've got enough information here to cover everything. Now, the lizard brain, or the reptilian brain, is the oldest part of the brain altogether, and it governs, or the oldest part of the organ, which covers every waking moment. And the reptilian brain was the only brain the ancient animals had, and it had to do everything. It had to do with perambulation, eating, feeding, breeding, safeguarding, survival, all sorts of things, and it was the only brain they had. There wasn't awareness, as far as we're able to tell. It wasn't conscious in the way that we understand it now, because self-awareness just didn't exist way back then. So anger, of course, was never ever a voluntary response, and it still is not. It's a primitive, automatic, aggressive reaction to a perceived threat, and that's exactly what it is still. Now, any of you that have been prone to a sudden anger outburst because something has really suddenly pushed a button will know that you don't stop and think, do you know what? I think I'll be angry. Or, do you know what? I think I'll try to punish this person. That just doesn't happen. Anger flares, and it's one of the strongest and most overriding emotional responses, or if you like, psychological responses that we have. And it's enormously difficult to subdue for various reasons, which I'm hoping that you'll understand by the time I get to the end of this evening's seminar. I've written a very nice anger busting script, which you'll see later, and that's included as part of these notes. And some of you may already know, this is the precursor to the anger management course, which will be sometime in 2018. I haven't got a date for it yet. It's got to be written yet. It's all planned out, but it'll be available in 2018. So anger is the oldest emotional response in existence. It's 650 million years old. It's probably universal to all animals, only it doesn't necessarily look the same in all animals. It's not the only reason why it's so difficult to manage it, and it's to do with the way that the brain works. And the reason why it's so difficult to manage is because it fires up before we're aware of it. By the time we're aware of it, it's already firing. Modern brain is the brainstem, often referred to in biological terms as the hindbrain, midbrain and forebrain. The midbrain is actually tiny, and if you've seen the Paul D. MacLean triune brain, don't get confused with that, because it's much smaller than that suggests. That's a conceptual brain which we use for training only. Biologically, the midbrain is small, and it appears to be, its main function appears to be to transfer data from the reptilian brain, or the hindbrain, brainstem, to the forebrain where we make sense of it. And there's probably some translation along the way, because the reptilian brain, brainstem, deals with data only. There's no right or wrong, good or bad. It doesn't even work with memories. It works with responses to stimuli. That's all it responds to. And this is why it's a very simple bit of kit. And that's what the earliest brains were, a very simple bit of kit. So that's the brain stem. The midbrain is tiny between the two, sits on top of the brain stem and looks like part of the brain stem actually. And its task is to transfer information in both directions. That's right, Genevieve. I saw you just log on. In both directions, from the hindbrain to the forebrain. Now, the forebrain is the big complicated bit, the bit that where awareness is. There's a blurring of it as well because not all of the forebrain is conscious, and the limbic system is associated with parts of the forebrain, but the unconscious parts of the forebrain. So we started a problem. The old lizard brain, the reptilian complex, brain stem, if you like, responds instantly to stimuli, just as it's always done. And it fires up the physical response when the information passes into the midbrain and then into the forebrain. It takes time. Now, you notice that anger has always got a physical response. If you can hear my dog barking, apologies. He'll probably stop in a minute. Bertie's voice is well known on the internet. He often pipes up when I'm teaching. So that early response, that fires up about a third of a second before we're aware of it. And by the time we're aware of it, it's covered around 50 meters of neural pathways and being tested over and again to see if it's a valid response. So by the time you're aware of the physical sensation, and it's not just an emotional response, as you probably are aware, anger has got a strong physical component to it. And by the time we've got that, it's already fired up. It's a part of the brain, the forebrain, is in charge of voluntary action. That is all logical processes, speech, recognition, taste, what we can see, smell, sound, and so on. It's a very busy part of the brain. And the best that it can manage, the best it can do with anger, which is a third of a second old by the time it gets there, which in brain time, that's a huge length of time. The best it can manage is to stop whatever's happening, but even that feedback signal, or moderate it, that feedback signal will be the result of the lizard brain recognizing a learned response that in these circumstances, the action is undesirable. So let's suppose, for instance, you're confronted by a mugger, somebody with a gun or a knife or whatever. Your instant response is going to be either to freeze, run away, or fight. If it's fight, it's based on anger. But it will be a third of a second before another part of the brain says, well, hold on, he's bigger than me, and he's got a weapon. So the message goes back to the brain, this is not a suitable time to carry out that response. So we actually manifest, we stop the anger. The way the most important thing in the way that the brain works is based on some experiments in 1983 by Benjamin Libet. Again, if you've done BWRT, you've already heard of this. If you haven't, you're about to learn something interesting. With his test volunteers wired up to electronics, he was able to show that there's what's called a readiness potential. That is, the brain starts to do something about half a second, more than half a second, before they're aware of it. And a third of a second before we're aware of it, the brain is actually doing a specific thing. So if it's a movement, a third of a second before we're aware of it, it's actually triggered the nerves in the brain that will move that part of the body. So if there's an urge to hit something or whatever, the parts of the brain that moves the arm will already be active a third of a second. So by the time we're aware of it, the action has already started. And that's why many things are nearly impossible to stop. We can get control of them, but we can't stop them completely. This is why I often say you can't control your feelings. You can only control what you do with them. Anger is one of the most difficult feelings to control because it's linked to the original survival response. So we've not got the machinery to override it because it can feel as if we're very vulnerable if we override it. So an example of the inability to control what that lizard brain does. And if you're confused by that, lizard brain, hindbrain, brainstem, all the same thing, reptilian brain, it's got all those names and it means the same thing. It's the bit of brain that sits immediately on top of the brainstem. And you could be forgiven for thinking it wasn't even part of the brain. It doesn't look like part of the brain. So here's an example of what it does. An individual observes another individual who they perceive as sexually attractive. There's an instant automatic commencement of genital arousal and possibly an emotional response at the same time. That's more prevalent in the male animal than it is in the female animal, but present in both. Heart rate and respiration will increase and pupils will widen. There's absolutely nothing that you can do with that. So heart rate and respiration will increase and pupils will widen. These are normal sexual responses. If they're both in the right situation, there may be an advance toward each other. If the situation isn't right, then the individual will give a feedback signal to not advance, but it will be a conscious recognition rather than a decision. So, just to recap that, an example of our inability to control what the lizard brain does: an individual observes another individual they perceive as sexually attractive. There's an instant automatic commencement of genital arousal and possibly an emotional response at the same time. Heart rate and respiration will increase and pupils will widen. If they're both in the right situation, there might be an advance towards each other. If the situation is not right, not suitable, unacceptable, or whatever, then the individual will give a feedback signal to not advance. But there will have been a conscious recognition as, I can't do that, I mustn't do that. Here's another one. That's innate instinct. This one is learned. Somebody we'll call Bill appears to throw something at somebody we'll call Ben. You all know about Bill and Ben if you remember the old English television programs. If you're not in England, they may not have had Bill and Ben in foreign parts. Bill appears to throw something at Ben. Ben starts to duck, but at the same time realizes that Bill's hand is empty. But he can't completely stop ducking because it's already started and the brain and the muscles are committed to the movement. You've all experienced that sort of thing. The recognition of the empty hand will possibly trigger another reaction on the first one, often laughter, but it will depend on prior learning. So here's a major problem. Anger carries a particular problem with it because it's linked to survival. So evolution has seen to it that it only truly subsides once the perceived threat has been dealt with or otherwise passed. Now, this is a very important part of this seminar. I'm going to say it again. Anger carries a particular problem with it because it's linked to survival, and evolution has seen to it that it only really subsides once the perceived threat has been dealt with or otherwise passed. And even then, it's usually some time before the anger impulse is fully discharged. While it's there, it tends to override or colour just about every other psychological experience. You know, if you've experienced great anger, it overrides absolutely every single thing. And that makes sense because it'd be no good firing up aggression as a result of a threat to life, only for it to subside while the threat is still present, or for it to fall prey to some distraction. So we're not easily distracted from anger. So it's a very important process that it's linked to survival. Now, here is where I ask you to give me a couple of OKs. Type OK if you understand why that is a very important facet. And it's something which, when you understand it, you can, good, excellent. Once you understand it, absolutely right, Sandra, it takes over your entire psyche and it becomes controlling. Now, this all worked extremely well for our ancient ancestors and probably just as well for the earliest males, the earliest hominins, the Australopithecines and earliest Homo genius. But it doesn't work so well for our civilized society. Back in those days, we're talking, 150,000, 200,000 years ago, anger was a very necessary aspect of life, and it would be discharged as necessary, and there'd be no problem with that. But now, because we live in what we would call a civilized society, things are somewhat different. It's no less powerful, but discharging it is fraught with all sorts of possible repercussions. So we sometimes have to swallow the anger. And that will give us all sorts of stresses and anxieties and stomach upsets and all sorts of things. The individual who used it most frequently in those days, most violently and effectively, became more confident in their ability to banish threats. And so they were ever more likely to exercise their vanquishing skills whenever perceived it to be necessary. Tansy, yes, Asperger's shows that very, very clearly because the control centers are not working as well. And that is purely and simply because the lack of empathy, and it's not his fault, you know that already. Because he has Asperger's, he doesn't have an empathetic connection, so doesn't have the realization that his anger needs to calm down. And it will take him a long, long time to calm down. Tansy, is this helping you to understand why he works the way he does? I'm hoping it does. Yeah, and I'm hoping that all of you that work with Asperger's or anything on the autistic spectrum, this gives you an understanding. It's a primeval response, and it's designed to be there to keep him safe. That's exactly why it's designed. The individual who used it most violently effective became more practiced at it, and that is still the case. The person who practices anger more is even better at it. And the more anger somebody has, the more angry they can become. Nothing changed. So I've got to scroll my notes a bit. Nothing has changed. The more an individual gets a desired result by the employment of anger and aggression, the more readily and vigorously they will employ it. that desired result, it might not necessarily be the death of any antagonist. So some people would say that's the subconscious wish, modified by awareness of the possible consequences. Even that awareness sometimes is completely sublimated by the urge to destroy. So somebody gets hit with a big dose of anger, and their sense of survival feels that they've got to destroy that which is causing the anger. So it overrides the sense that they may well get themselves into a great deal of trouble. That overrides that completely. So they actually go barging in and sometimes commit a murder or at least GBH because at that moment they've got the red mist, and to them it's a survival. When it's a much lesser situation, David, I'm just about to talk about that. When it's a much lesser situation, such as a domestic dispute or some other threat, somebody behaving stupidly, as David has just said, but you see, there is a threat, David. You're just not recognizing it, and most people don't. Because the reptilian complex is simple. Something is either safe or it's unsafe. And there is nothing in between. There's no gray areas. If something doesn't gel and doesn't feel right, it's unsafe. And so anger is a very possible response. There's degrees of anger, obviously, because it's moderated by our conscious mind. But the fact is, the early brain has switched into that response. Now, when you begin to understand this, it gives you a much greater insight into anger. When I was researching for this seminar, my insight into anger increased enormously. I'm hoping to be able to impart that to all of you this evening. And that's it. It's polarized. The reptilian complex doesn't do judgment. Value judgments are made much later. Same thing, Zainab. They're viewing it, whatever's it's the junior threat to survival. They want to do something they're not allowed to do. And if you're not allowed to do something, it means you're vulnerable. Does that make sense to everybody? If you're stopped from doing something, as far as the brain is concerned, if you want to do it and somebody's stopping you, it's dangerous. So a child who's not yet learned to moderate everything will actually go into temper tantrum. So any threat, no matter what it is perceived by the brainstem as being a threat to survival. A threat is a threat. It's a threat to survival. Anger is a possible response. Not everybody suffers anger. Some people might go into retreat instead. Because most people that suffer spontaneous anger are people who would fight rather than flee, or rather than freeze. So not everybody suffers anger or spontaneous anger. But nonetheless, when it fires up, whatever personality type is experiencing it, anger overrides a huge amount of stuff, disturbs the whole body system. Some research at MIT in 2007, small studies of murderers and people with antisocial behavior, show that the prefrontal cortex, that is the area of the brain concerned with impulse control, that's the very front of the brain, in the frontal lobes, they were smaller than those of the control subjects. And it's not, they weren't really sure whether it's cause or effect. And there's some conjecture that it might possibly be a congenital defect, so that somebody is born with a predisposition to not being able to control. It's also linked to the inability to delay gratification, and I'm sure that makes sense. Those of us that have what we'll call normal or average ability to control gratification, to wait and see in effect, we might control anger to see if we can find another way of dealing with it. Some people don't have that ability to delay gratification. They want to be angry, they want to shout and rage or hit whatever, so they do just that. So it lends weight to the argument that some individuals are born with the tendency rather than having been damaged in some way by nurture. Now, there's a tendency among many therapists to believe that everybody is born beautiful, and I promise you, I'm not going to get into a discussion on this tonight because that can rumble on. Some therapists believe that everybody is born beautiful, and therefore anybody that exhibits any form of antisocial behavior has been damaged by nurture. As it happens, don't believe that, but I'm not going to get into discussion with it tonight. It's a subject of another course probably. There is a lot of conjecture that it's people are born. People are born with 6 fingers instead of 5. They're born with legs missing, feet missing. You know, they're born with physical deformities. It's not too much of a stretch to imagine that the brain might have a deformity as well, which leads to irrational behavior. Anyway, as I said, I'm not going to get onto that one tonight because it's fraught with all sorts of things, usually people telling me off and telling me I'm unfair. So, it's important to recognize from the therapist's point of view, the early brain is non-selective. Oh, I said something like this just now, didn't I? Oh, okay, Claire. Yeah, you see, this may be the case, and that's not trained. Okay, David, good. I'm glad at least one of you is agreeing with me. From the therapist's point of view, the early brain is non-selective, it's non-rational, it doesn't have any value judgment, it doesn't recognize good or bad. All it is responses. It's responses to a threat. It will do anything to survive, to help us survive. So, from the therapist's point of view, we need to recognize a threat is a threat, whatever it's related to. This comes back to what David was saying earlier when it's not necessarily survival, a threat is a threat. So, any situation that leaves an individual feeling disadvantaged in any way can be the trigger for anger. Whether or not it's expressed is a little important. But there's different types of anger, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. Different types of anger, and each needs a slightly different approach as far as therapy is concerned. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment. Oh, okay, Sandra, then you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, because you spot it, and I've spoken to teachers who told me they can spot embryonic psychosis in a 4-year-old. Mark, absolutely right. Thank you for that. If the response hasn't killed you, it's the correct response. So if you react with anger and you survive, and you feel that you've survived, and you get a feeling of survival, it's the correct response. Now, the trouble is, a lot of the time now, people aren't learning any boundaries. People are learning that it's fine to express anger. They're allowed to express themselves at home. But the trouble is that they're now expressing themselves to policemen and to anybody else. And so that lack of a boundary is creating what looks like a psychotic outburst in some people. And unfortunately, it's not really their fault. They're just never being taught how to rein that in, to wait and see, or to listen to somebody else to see what they've got to say. They just haven't got that facility because it was never taught to them when they were young. It's not natural to not do anything when something fires you up. They're behaving much more naturally than we are, as unpalatable as that might be. The person that rails against a policeman trying to arrest them is behaving in a much more natural way than the person who gets a bit put out but goes along with it. Correct, Kate. No superego. Absolutely right. Sandra, emotional intelligence lacking in many people. You're absolutely right. And David, neuroscience is showing a lot with anxiety and depression. There's a school of thought that says depression is anger turned inwards, and it sometimes is. But a lot of the time, depression is the result of thwarted wishes. And the stronger the wish that is thwarted or limited, the more likely depression is to be the result. In younger males, males between 20 and 40, and you know there's a huge, huge element of depression in males at the moment, in their 20s. And I'd love to do some research on it. I haven't got the funds or the abilities to do it, but I wouldn't mind betting that depression in younger males is due to sexual dissatisfaction, because at that point they're primed to search out sex. They're not allowed to. We've got this equality thing where they have to be very careful what they say. So a lot of the time, a young male's sexual wishes cannot be fulfilled. And yes, absolutely right, Sarah. And I have researched to the fact that when the sexual life of a male is not as he wishes it to be, it causes depression. And I teach that on my courses, and it's the biggest cause of depression ever. And there are more males reporting depression than females. Females, if their sexual desires and wishes are not met, usually suffer anxiety instead. They don't usually go into the depression mode. Yes, Tanya, instant gratification, you're absolutely right. So although I haven't covered that in here, depression is sometimes a replacement for anger, maybe, or replacement for an activity that they could not conduct. So various types of anger, each needs a slightly different approach. Now, tonight we're going to work on just one of them. Kate, realistic expectations. Yes, absolutely. Kate, thank you for that, because I admitted that. It was in my mind, but I didn't say so. Males see far more porn than they ever used to, and they have this unrealistic expectation. They believe that is what normal sex should be, and they're not getting it, so they get offended. They get hurt by it. Sandra, yes, absolutely. Sandra, you've understood this at a high level. I suspect, Sandra, that when we finish this, you'll want to do the anger management course, and I think it will actually give you an area to work in which you may not have considered. You may choose to be a specialist in anger, because from the things you're saying here, it's evident to me that you've worked with a lot of this stuff before. And I'm sometimes switch into mild arrogance and believe I've researched stuff that other people haven't noticed. I think I've really covered one or two of those things, like the way the brain works. So if I come over with a bit up myself, I'll apologise. No, you're right, Sarah. The unrealistic expectations certainly don't help. But Sandra, I have a strong feeling that you will want to work strongly with anger, because I think that because the way you've worked and working with children like that and recognizing it at an early stage, having that understanding of it is going to give you a great way of working. Yeah, yeah, humor is good. It's difficult to be angry at anything that you're laughing at, isn't it? So, different types of anger. We're going to work with one of these tonight. It's just a very simple hypnosis version. But the different types of anger: retaliatory, which is the situation where the individual responds to all or most challenges with anger; residual, lurking deep in the psyche and expressed whenever the opportunity arises; chronic, the individual with chronic anger is angry all the time for no specific reason. These are all the sorts of angers you might encounter. Spontaneous, anger is expressed out of the blue in somebody who is in the normal way balanced or even quite calm, and suddenly, abruptly, there is raging anger. Situational, self-evident, the individual only gets truly angry under certain situations that may or may not be peculiar to them. They may get angry in situations which wouldn't fire other people up, but it certainly fires them. Controlling, this is where anger is used to keep others subservient. It's the domain of the bad boss or bullying parent or spouse. The controlling anger, that's always the domain of the person who is based on fear. It doesn't look like fear, but it is fear. It's in warrior settlers and nomads terms, it's the domain of the warrior tyrant who seeks to control everybody with volume. And it tells you they're frightened of volume themselves. They're frightened of people shouting and raging, so they perceive it as a huge weapon, and they give the game away. And every time somebody tries to control others by shouting and raging, what they're saying is, I'm frightened of you, I've got to go to grip with you. And it doesn't matter how it's expressed, that's what it means. Defensive. Defensive anger arises where the individual is not easily able to express their reasoning for a situation, might indicate a cheat because they haven't got a substance there. So just to run through those again, the 7 different types of anger that I'll be working with, one tonight and the rest on the anger management course: retaliatory, residual, chronic, spontaneous, situational, controlling, and defensive. Anybody got any questions to do with these that I've talked about so far? Michael, which one is it that you recognize? The controlling one, I suspect. You've probably been on the other end of it, I imagine. Yeah, so you've been on the other end. Yeah, I thought so, Michael. If you've been on the end of it, you recognize it quickly. So are you all okay with what we've done so far, with where I am with this so far? Good, okay. Yep, the overpowering voice one, that's right. Helen, frustration. Yes, frustration will come under often the situational one, because it will be the frustrated in a particular situation. Residual, Eileen, that's a great question. Thank you. Residual anger will usually be related to not to a past happening, but to a series. It's like cumulative trauma. Does that make sense to you, Eileen? It's like cumulative trauma. The similar things happen over and over and over again. And it's really the person's perception of that things have, and especially being got at them. Yeah, I thought that might be what it is. So yes, you're right. It's related to past events where the person remains angry. But usually the person with residual anger isn't angry all the time, but they have the potential for anger all the time. So, you know, the average person goes into a shop and somebody gives them 10 pence, little change, too little change. And the average person will say, oh, look, sorry, you've shortchanged me. The person with residual anger is like, don't you pay bloody attention, look, you short. In other words, the tiniest excuse. Yes, that's absolutely right, Sandra. And the tiniest excuse to discharge it. And what they're trying to do is to discharge the anger they haven't been able to discharge on previous occasions. We're going to look at how to work effectively with the first one on the list, the retaliatory anger. And as I've said, when you get them, in the 6-lesson anger management course, I'll be covering a lot more information and more work methods. So before commencing work, we have to consider the effect of any agenda or secondary gain. Now, here's the thing with anger. It's there for a purpose. It's not unusual for the individual suffering retaliatory anger to believe they need it to maintain their position in the world and not to be taken advantage of. They think if they haven't got the anger, people are going to ride all over them. There's often an underlying low self-worth and a sense of inadequacy, that they may believe that their anger is the only thing that allows them to maintain social equality. And even though they're presenting with anger as an issue that needs resolution, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be easy the idea of reducing it. At the very least, they won't want to reduce its ferocity. At the very least, they'll need some reassurance that when anger is a rational response, it will still be available to them as a resource. Now, never ever commence therapy for this issue without discussion about agendas and secondary gain, because almost everybody is going to have a secondary gain or an agenda there. And if you start to commence therapy before you've addressed that, they're going to be resistant, or they will possibly be resistant. So you will need to talk about it and point out to them that anger is a survival process, and how important do they feel that anger is, or to tell you what situations they think that the anger might be helping them in. So you're going to explore agendas and gains, and never believe anybody who says, no, it does nothing for me, I hate it. They have it for a reason. It may be they can't remember what it is, but they will still know what they're trying to do with it now. Otherwise, although it's not a voluntary response, it's voluntary to continue it. And many people, when they switch their anger on, can't turn it off for a couple of days, and they take it on other people as well. So we're going to look at the script that I've written for this, and I'm going to go through it piecemeal so you can see why it's written the way it is. You'll need a good state of hypnosis, as good as the client can achieve, and really the deeper the better, because anger carries, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, that carries a very high energy. And if there's an agenda not to release it, it will inhibit the success of what we're going to do here. So because I don't think you'll discharge every agenda and secondary gain, and in fact it may be even that the client gets angry with you when you try to access those things, because again it's a threat to survival, or if it's a threat to survival, they're trying to protect it. So you need, once you've managed to get them into a calm state or a calm enough state, you need a very deep induction. Now if you've got the book Crucial from Hypnosense, one of my books, which obviously a bit of a shameless sales plug. If you've got Crucial, the long combo is excellent. If you haven't got that, you want any other paired induction and deepener. There's a matched induction and deepener that are based on brain entrainment rather than relaxation. Don't use confusional techniques. That will irritate the hell out of somebody who suffers anger. So you don't want confusional techniques. You do want brain entrainment. A good example of brain entrainment is the 7 ± 2, and I think probably most of you know that one. And that's a good example of an induction. And so the angry person doesn't really, male or female, doesn't really do flowery and imaginative imagery. So you really need to make sure that you've got a down-to-earth. 7 ± 2 is good. Crucial you won't need a deepener with, because it is in itself, you could call it an in-deepener. If you use 7 ± 2, you probably will need a deepener afterwards. Before I go through the script, have we got any questions? I see some of you have been writing. No, there aren't any notes, Jane. No, I did say that earlier, and the notes are not on screen. Okay, they're not supposed to be on screen. No problem, no need to apologise. You probably weren't on when I said I'm not putting the notes up, because if I put the notes up, you all start reading it, and then it jars here and there, because I'm not reading the notes, I'm working from them. But if you're reading something that is different from what I'm saying, it doesn't gel, and then your mind goes into a kind of a lock state where it can't work out which is right. So that's why there are no notes there. Notes will be, well, I'll give you the link in a minute. You can download them. Where are we? Right, body can give suppressed anger away. Absolutely right. Good. I'm just checking through things that I've said in case I need to respond to it. No problem, Georgine. I never need to apologise in this place. And Jane. Angie, yeah, 7 ± 2 is good. If you've got the Crucial book, I would recommend using the long combo rather than the 7 ± 2. It's not brain entrainment, but it works extremely well with just about any person. Who's got Crucial? Who's got the book Crucial? As a matter of interest, if you've got it, yeah, okay. If you haven't got it, you might be able to persuade somebody to give you just the long combo out of it, which wouldn't be fair on me, but there you go. If you haven't got it, oh, hello, Tracy Harrison Racy. You're newly qualified. Welcome to, if this is the first online seminar you've been to, welcome. You've missed a bit of it, but it's all recorded, so you'll get that. And you're about to hear the induction that we use to get rid of this hypnotherapy script I've written to avoid it. Okay, good, excellent. Right, now I'm going to, these notes, the notes for the anger program are on here, so I'm going to get those out in a minute. Oh, okay, Genevieve, on its own it can help. On its own, it can help. Now, you will see these notes here because, there we go. You can see, I just confirm you can all see the notes. It's called the anger latch. You'll see why it's called the anger latch in a minute. Good. Okay. That's all right, Emma. You missed all the reasoning behind it, but it's all recorded anyway. But you'll still, I think, like this script. Now, you can read the script. I'm going to read the script because I want you to hear what it sounds like, and you'll understand why this is very rarely do I do pride. Most of you know that. No, I can't actually, Louise. They're as big as they'll go, so you'll hear them anyway. I can't make them any bigger, unfortunately. They're full size, but you'll hear them anyway. Louise, if you're on a phone or an iPad, that's probably the problem. If you're on a desktop or a laptop, you can probably see them okay. But you'll get the notes. The recording is an MP4, which you can expand to fill your whole screen. So you'll see it again. Yeah. Oh, okay, Louise. Get a magnifying glass. If I make them any bigger, I could make them bigger, but then it will go off the screen at the sides, and then I can't read it. So okay. So anyway, I'm going to read this. So okay, folks. So you're not going to be in hypnosis. This assumes that you've already done a long induction, and you deliver this script in something which is very close to a matter-of-fact style, as you hear. Oh, okay, yeah, I know. Well, Nick knows my stuff extremely well, and Lorraine, of course, because I used to lecture quite frequently at CCH. I don't these days, but they all know my work. So, don't deliver this. Don't make any attempt to deliver it in anything vaguely resembling a hypnotic voice. You will anger the angry person. It needs to sound like conversation. That's what it. Thank you, Michael. It needs to sound like conversation. So, we're assuming your client is in hypnosis. I wonder if you can imagine walking down a long corridor in your mind somehow. It seems to slope gently downwards and it's got a curve to it, so you can't actually see the end of it. And as you travel along this corridor, it slowly dawns on you that it's actually endless. And although you know you're going deeper and deeper, you also know that when you arrive at the far end of it, you'll somehow be exactly where you're supposed to be, maybe where you are right now, even though you can't quite work that out right at this moment. And while you're still pondering on this rather odd idea, you realize there are doors at intervals in one wall of this corridor, and only you know whether that corridor curves to the right or to the left, and whether the doors are on the outer wall, or if that's the wall beyond which is the outside world, so the doors are on the other side, and however your mind sees them is exactly as it should be. One of the doors catches your attention, and for reasons you don't quite understand and don't much care about either, you suddenly realize that this room is why you're here. Before you can reach out to push the door, it silently opens, closing gently behind you again as you move inside. It seems very familiar to you, though you can't really think why it should be, and it's a rather strange room anyway. Instrument screens set into the walls and all manner of knobs and buttons, levers and dials, all unlabeled and in no apparent order, just randomly placed into the walls of this room. You experimentally jab your finger at one of the buttons and nearly jump out of your skin as a sudden cacophony of noise clamours all around you, and a series of flashes come from somewhere near the ceiling, and you quickly jab at that button again, and everything falls quiet once more. You breathe a sigh of relief, but then realise just for a split second that for some reason it reminds you of the feeling in your mind and body when anger strikes, when somebody else pushes a button. This amuses you, and for some dark reason, and so you push the button on and off a few times, somehow enjoying the ability to control what's happening. As you consider that, you notice a small control next to the button. It might be a lever or a rotary knob of some sort, and it has a label underneath it that just says limiter. You notice that it's turned all the way down, all the way to maximum, and so you adjust it to about halfway and jab at that button again, and the same cacophony of sound appears, only it's not so much a cacophony this time as just a rather loud noise. You wonder about turning the control further down, and while you're pondering on that, you notice there's another control on the other side of the knob, a small switch. This one is labelled latch. Okay, pause there for a minute. How are you finding this so far? I see, Louise, you've managed to find the full screen. Good. How are you finding this so far? I hope you're noticing the embedded commands and the secret suggestions the client isn't going to notice. Shirley from hypnosense.com. You'll find it on hypnosense.com. There's a couple of things which I need to draw your attention to because it is very, very powerful. the phrase when somebody else pushes a button. Okay, well, it is, Tracy. It's a bit like the control room, sort of, and there are a lot of embedded commands in it. But the place to pause, it's very important. I'm going to read this bit again. You breathe a sigh of relief, but then realize just for a second that for some reason it reminded you of the feeling in your mind and body when anger strikes, when somebody else pushes a button. This amuses you for some reason. Now you see what we've done. We've put the amusement associated with somebody else pushing a button, and I'm hoping that you've all understood. It's quite secret. It's almost subliminal. The client isn't going to recognize it. You all will recognize it, and of course it is a control room type of idea, but it's not your standard control room. Okay, good. It's not the standard type of control room, as you're about to discover. It's got different controls in it. So, a small switch, and this one is labeled latch. You press the switch to off and jab your finger at the button again, and that same familiar sound starts up, but this time it stops as soon as you take your finger away from the button. You experiment a couple of times, and you find a strange sense of satisfaction at being able to control whether the anger is loud, medium, or almost non-existent, and whether once it's started, it stays until you decide to turn it off, or, next page, or whether you have to deliberately maintain it by holding a button on all the time. And you decide that just for the moment, you're going to leave the latch control in the off position, and the limiter set to halfway. Now, here's the optional place. The optional part is you can move around the room, noticing the other controls work for different anger situations. So it's a control room, but it's specific. Emma, I did say I'm only covering one type of anger tonight. This is for that particular type of anger. If you want to learn how to deal with chronic anger, then you'll need to be on the anger management course. I can't cover everything in a 1 hour lesson. So the optional thing is to move around the room, noting the other controls work for different anger situations. So you could try that, Emma, if you wanted to. And this will be covered in great detail in the planned anger management course that will incorporate this script in addition to a lot of other resources. So in the anger management course, this script will be included, but it will have all sorts of plugins and add-ons and things you can put in instead. It will be personality related as well, so it'll have bits that you add in for different personalities. This is the basic script, but it is the very basic script. Other things will get added into it. So we finish with, you turn to leave the room and a sudden realization strikes you. You might sometimes feel anger because this is just a normal part of being human. But now, if somebody else pushes a button, it's entirely up to you whether or not it stays pushed. You smile to yourself, wondering how those who do their best to push a button will feel when they realize it's you who has control, not them. That you can adjust those controls whenever you want to, if necessary, that you are in control. There's something extraordinarily satisfying about that thought as you leave the room and the door closes gently behind you and into this strange corridor that now slopes gently upwards, whichever way you look along it. And as you move easily along that corridor, you notice a kind of lightness around you, as if you've somehow let go of some weight that was never really a part of you anyway. And as you think that thought, you realize that you're very nearly all the way back up to the top of your mind in thoughts now, and that's where you'll count 1 to 5 to bring the client up to the top. Well, that's worked out very well. I reckon I'd get to that point 15 minutes before we finished, a little bit over, 12 minutes before we finished, which is plenty of time for some questions. Thank you very much. I must admit, I'm proud of that script. I don't do pride in what I've written in the normal way, but I am very proud of that particular script. When I read it through, I thought, wow, that really works. Well, it's got loads of embedded stuff. And don't forget, that's only the basic script. The delivery, and Tony, just as I was delivering it, conversational. Now, I'm not sure if you're telling me the delivery was good. I don't care, to be honest. How I delivered it is how I envisage it being delivered. Grazie, Giuseppe. Grazie. Angie, yes, you might find it useful, actually. So I haven't done Mark. It's to be written, and it will be in 2018. I will be running the course in 2018. This was for the first type of anger, Tracy, which was the retaliatory type of anger. Now, Ria, has this made sense? Why The child is under threat. The child feels under threat from something. And the trouble is, you see, that a child gets angry, and what do the parents do? They get angry back and start shouting back. And the child views it as a threat. So the anger won't subside. So you can see, and you can help the parents to understand, but you can also help the person to understand precisely why they have trouble letting go of it. And I think that once you've actually helped the client to understand it's a survival process, which is in these days out of place, I think that you're going to help people a huge amount with it. I'm going to put the link up here for you to download the notes. I mean, if somebody wants to check that, the link, I did test it earlier. That's the link for the notes. Eileen, that's a great question. I don't think so, because this is based on my nearly 30 years in practice and casting my mind back over the people I've spoken to and people that I've known and people that I know indeed. And I think that really, I mean, and it's not fair to say that somebody might have only one type of anger. There are people that express anger at all different things. Some people laugh at stuff that other people might be angry about. And some people get angry and people laugh at stuff they'd be angry about. So, it's a bit complicated. Michael, there's a great truth there. If you get your own way from anger, then indeed you will be intoxicated with anger and use it over and over again. Okay, good question. I can't answer that definitively. I think some people are born with a disposition towards anger more than others.